I was in the middle of a client call, a real one, the kind where you can't pause, can't breathe wrong, can't let anything crack, when my brother walked into my office like he owned the floor, the furniture, and probably me too. He didn't knock, he never knocked. I held up one finger to signal him to wait, and I watched him look around my office the same way he used to look at my childhood bedroom, like it was something he was entitled to eventually. My assistant was right behind him, mouthing, "I'm so sorry," from the doorway. I shook my head slightly so she'd know it wasn't her fault. It wasn't. You can't stop someone who has never once in his life accepted the word no. I finished the call. I set the phone down carefully, and then I looked at my brother and said, "You have about 3 minutes before my next meeting." He sat down without being invited. He smiled, the way he always smiled, that particular smile that meant he thought he was doing me a favor by showing up. "I've been thinking," he said, "that it's time we made this a family business." I want to tell you I laughed. I didn't. I just looked at him and waited. Let me back up because none of this makes sense without the before. I grew up outside of Hamilton, Ontario, one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows your business and nobody talks about the parts that matter. My parents weren't cruel in the dramatic way people sometimes imagine. They were cruel in the quiet, daily accumulated way that's harder to explain and harder to prove. My brother was 3 years older than me, and from the time I can remember, he was the one my parents talked about when company came over. His hockey, his grades, which were average at best, his future, which they described with a confidence they never once applied to mine. I wasn't the invisible child. It's more accurate to say I was the useful one. I helped my mother with everything: groceries, her bookkeeping for the small clothing alterations business she ran from the house, driving my father to his appointments after his knee surgery, tutoring my brother through grade 11 math that he should have been able to do on his own. I did all of it without complaint, because I had learned early that complaining changed nothing and cost you something. When I was 17, I told my parents I wanted to study business. My father said, "What for?" Not cruelly, just genuinely confused about why I would need that. My mother said I should look at something more practical, maybe a 2 year college program, something I could do locally so I wouldn't have to leave. My brother, that same year, announced he was going to take a year off before figuring out his next step. They bought him a used truck to make the year easier. I applied to the Schulich School of Business at York University without telling anyone. I got in. I applied for every scholarship I could find and got enough to cover most of it. I took out student loans for the rest. I worked 20 hours a week all 4 years. When I told my parents I was leaving for Toronto, my mother cried, not because she was proud, because who was going to help her with the alterations ledger? I want to say that things got better after that. That distance gave us a new language. But the truth is, the distance just made the dynamic more obvious. My parents called when they needed something, a form filled out, advice about a contractor who had overcharged them, help navigating a benefits renewal. They called less often to ask how I was doing, and when they did, the question felt more like a pause before the real reason for the call. My brother, meanwhile, had tried 3 different ventures by the time I was 26. A landscaping company that lasted 1 season, a dropshipping store he described as basically printing money for about 4 months before it collapsed, a partnership with a friend in a food truck that ended when the friend sold the truck and left the province. Each time there was a reason: bad timing, a difficult partner, an unexpected cost. Never, not once, was the reason him. I had been building my company for 4 years when I finally started to feel like it was real. I ran a supply chain consulting firm. I know that sounds dry, but in Canada's manufacturing and retail sectors, when you get it right, it is genuinely valuable work. I had 7 full-time employees, a handful of contractors, and a client list that included 3 mid-sized retail chains and a logistics company based out of Mississauga. We had just closed our best quarter. I had just signed a lease on a proper office in downtown Hamilton, back where I started, which felt meaningful to me even if it felt like nothing to anyone else. I made the mistake of telling my parents about the new office at Sunday dinner. I should have known better. I did know better. I went anyway because I was still at 29 years old, hoping that the version of my parents I wished existed would show up instead of the ones who actually did. My mother said the rent sounded high. My father asked if I had a business partner yet, because running something alone was a lot of risk for a woman. My brother, who had come to dinner uninvited and eaten most of the chicken, looked up from his phone and said, "Yeah, you should talk to me about that actually. I've been doing a lot of research into operations management." I drove home alone and sat in my car in the parking garage for about 10 minutes before I went upstairs. 3 weeks later, my brother showed up at the new office. That was the day I described at the beginning. The day he walked in without knocking, sat down without being invited, and told me it was time to make it a family business. What he meant, I learned over the next 15 minutes, was this. He wanted to come on as a co-director. He thought his name should be on the company alongside mine. He had been telling people, he mentioned this casually, like it was a normal thing to have done, that he was involved in operations at my firm. He had a friend who was interested in investing, and the friend had apparently been told that my brother had some kind of senior role. None of this was true. None of it had ever been discussed with me. I asked him what he thought a co-director position would involve. He said, "I'd handle the relationship side of things, networking, client dinners, that kind of thing." I asked if he had any background in supply chain consulting. He said he was a quick learner. I asked what his plan was for salary. He named a number that was higher than what I was paying myself. I told him I needed to think about it. I said it calmly. He left satisfied, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he had taken the conversation. I called my lawyer that same afternoon. Here is what I had never told my family. I had been keeping records for a long time, not because I anticipated this exact conversation, but because I am someone who works in logistics and operations, and documentation is not something I think about only at work. I had emails. I had text messages from my mother asking me to cover a shortfall in my parents' property tax payment, which I had done twice, with e-transfers that left a clean record. I had a message from my brother asking me to put in a good word with one of my clients on his behalf, which I had declined to do, and his response when I declined. I had a record of every time he had introduced himself to someone in my industry using language that implied a connection to my company that did not exist. I also, as of that afternoon, had a cease and desist letter drafted. My lawyer was very clear with me. If my brother had been representing himself as affiliated with my company to potential investors or clients, that was not just a family problem. That was potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. I didn't send the letter right away. I waited. 2 weeks after my brother's visit, my mother called me. She said she had heard that I was thinking about bringing my brother in, and that she was glad I was finally coming around to the idea of keeping things in the family. She said my father had always wanted to see us work together. She said that when my brother succeeded, it reflected well on everyone. I asked her what she meant by when my brother succeeded. She paused and then she said, "You know what I mean." I did know. I had always known. The moment anything I built had become visible enough to matter, it had also become something they expected to be shared. Not because they had contributed to it, but because shared success costs the person who built it and pays out to the people who didn't. And somehow that equation had always seemed fair to everyone in that house except me. I told my mother I wasn't bringing my brother on. I said it simply, without anger, the way you say a fact. She said I was being selfish. She said I had always had a problem accepting help. She said my brother had connections and energy that could take my company to the next level, and that I was too proud to admit I needed support. I said, "I need to go," and I ended the call. My father called the next day. He was calmer, which meant he had been appointed to try the reasonable approach. He said he understood that I had concerns, but that family was family, and that there was something wrong with a person who wouldn't extend a hand to their own blood. He said he'd heard about a company in Oakville that had gone under because the founder had no one to trust. He said I should think about legacy. I said I was thinking about it. Then I sent a cease and desist letter. My brother's response came through his phone at 11:30 at night. It was long. It covered a lot of ground, ingratitude, how much the family had sacrificed, a very creative retelling of our childhoods in which he had apparently spent years supporting and encouraging me in ways I had somehow failed to notice. There was a section about how I had always been competitive and had never been able to celebrate anyone else's success, which I found genuinely remarkable given that his most recent success had been selling a crockpot on Facebook Marketplace. My parents stopped calling after that. For 6 weeks, nothing, no texts, no emails. The silence was so complete that I actually checked twice to make sure my phone was working. I won't pretend those 6 weeks were easy. I want to be honest about that, because the version of the story where the estrangement feels clean and righteous right away is not the true version. Some evenings I sat in my apartment in Hamilton and thought about Sunday dinners and wondered if I had been too cold, too hard, too quick to protect myself at the expense of something that could have been salvaged. I'm human. I'm 31 years old and I still, on some level, wanted parents who were proud of me, for me and not for what I could provide. But then I would open my email and find something from a client. Or I would walk into the office in the morning and watch my team working on a project we had built from nothing, and the wondering would pass. The company kept growing. We brought on 2 new clients that quarter, one of them a mid-sized manufacturer in Brantford who had been referred by a client we'd had for 2 years. I hired a junior analyst fresh out of McMaster. We expanded our service offerings into demand forecasting, which I had been planning for 18 months. I wrote about it in a newsletter I sent to clients and industry contacts. I did not announce it to my family. 3 months after the cease and desist letter, my brother reached out again, not to apologize. He wanted to let me know he had started a new business, a business development consultancy, and that he had been approached by someone who was interested in partnering with a supply chain firm, and that he thought of me. He wanted to know if I'd be open to a referral arrangement. I read the message twice. The someone interested in partnering was, after a small amount of research, a man I had met once at a networking event in Burlington who had been vaguely looking for a strategic partner for a project that had never fully materialized. He had no funding, no clients, and no operational background. My brother had apparently been in contact with him and had represented himself as someone with connections in my firm. I forwarded the message chain to my lawyer. This is the part I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. My lawyer reached out to the man in Burlington professionally and without aggression to clarify that my brother had no affiliation with my company and no authority to represent it in any capacity. The man was, I think, genuinely embarrassed. He had been considering a small investment based in part on the implied connection. He had told 2 other people about the opportunity. Those 2 people had also been misled. My brother had not secured any actual investment, but the misrepresentation was documented, it was clear, and it had reached enough people that the potential for harm to my company's reputation was real and demonstrable. My lawyer sent a formal letter, not to my brother's personal address, to the registered address of his new consultancy, which turned out to be my parents' house in Hamilton. I don't know exactly what happened in that house the day the letter arrived. I wasn't there. But my mother called me within an hour, and for the first time in my memory, she sounded shaken. She said she didn't understand why I was doing this to the family. I said, I'm not doing anything to the family. I'm protecting something I built. She said my brother had only been trying to help. I said, he told potential investors he worked for my company. That's not help, that's fraud. That word landed differently than I expected. There was a long pause. She said, he didn't mean it like that. I said, intent doesn't change what it is. Another pause. Then, what do you want from us? I had thought about this. I had actually thought about it carefully over the previous weeks. because I knew eventually there would be a version of this conversation, and I wanted to be clear, not reactive. I told her I wanted my brother to stop using my company's name and reputation in any context. I wanted a written acknowledgement through my lawyer that he had no role or affiliation with my firm. I wanted no further contact from him regarding my business. I said that what happened after that personally was something we could talk about separately and in time, but the business piece was not negotiable and was not a starting point for a broader conversation. She said she would talk to my father. The written acknowledgement came through 4 days later. My brother signed it. I don't know what my parents said to him. I don't know if he was angry or ashamed or neither. My lawyer said the matter was resolved, legally speaking. She said I had handled it well. I sat in my office after that call and looked out at the street below. The same city where I had grown up feeling like a set of hands rather than a person, and I felt something I want to be careful about describing accurately because it wasn't triumphant exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a door finally closing on a draft that had been moving through the house for years. I have not spoken to my brother since. I have spoken to my parents twice, once at a family gathering I attended for about an hour, and once when my mother called to tell me my father was having a procedure done, which turned out to be minor and went fine. Both conversations were polite. Neither of them mentioned the letter or the business or the 6 weeks of silence. My mother asked if I was seeing anyone. I said I was doing well. I still run the company. It's bigger now than it was when any of this happened. I have 12 people on my team. We're expanding into a second service line next year. I signed the new lease without telling anyone in my family. Not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer felt like something that needed their reaction to become real. Someone asked me recently what I would do if my brother reached out again. I thought about it honestly. I said, that depends entirely on what he reaches out for. Because here is what I know now that I could not have articulated at 22 or even 27. The people who left you to build everything alone do not get to walk into what you built and call it a family project. That is not bitterness. That is just an accurate accounting of who did the work. I keep the records, I know the numbers, and after everything, I am still the one who shows up. I think about the version of myself that drove home from that Sunday dinner, the one where I told my parents about the new office and my mother said the rent sounded high. And I remember sitting in the parking garage for those 10 minutes, not crying, just very still. I didn't know then that I was about to be tested in a way I hadn't anticipated, but I also didn't know how ready I actually was. What I've come to understand is that the things that happened to me weren't random, not in a mystical sense. I don't mean fate or luck or anything like that. I mean that every outcome in that chapter of my life had a direct cause, and most of those causes were choices. My brother chose to use my name without permission. My parents chose to call it help, and I chose years earlier to document everything, to work the 20 hours a week, to apply to Schulich without telling anyone, to build something real instead of waiting for someone to hand me a role in theirs. Those choices compounded. That's how it works. The people who didn't show up when things were hard made a choice, and that choice had a consequence, not as punishment, but as a natural result. When you're absent for the building, you don't get a seat at the table. That's not cruelty. That's just an honest accounting. What carried me through wasn't anger. Anger was there, yes, but it wasn't the thing that kept me going at 22, 25, 29. What kept me going was something closer to integrity. The decision to do the work correctly, to treat my clients well, to pay my team fairly, to keep records not because I was paranoid, but because I believe that how you do things matters even when no one is watching, especially then. Doing the right thing when it costs you something, when it would be easier to cut a corner or let something slide, that's the thing that compounds too, quietly, over years, until it becomes the foundation everything else stands on. The intelligence piece, and I say this not to be immodest, but because I think it's worth naming, wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about being clear eyed, about not letting the story I wanted to be true override the story that was actually happening. My brother hadn't changed. My parents hadn't changed. I had spent years hoping they would, and the clarity I finally found wasn't a gift. It was something I had to choose repeatedly against the part of me that still wanted Sunday dinners to feel like something they never did. And then there's the part that nobody really talks about, which is just showing up. Every day, even the ones that were discouraging, even the quarters that were tighter than I'd planned, even the evenings I sat alone in my apartment and wondered if I'd been too hard, too protective, too slow to forgive. I showed up anyway. I kept building. I hired people and paid them on time and signed leases and wrote the newsletter and did the work. That consistency, the kind that doesn't require an audience or an occasion, is the thing I'm most proud of when I look back. I still keep the records. I still know the numbers. And after everything, the company is still standing, and I'm still the one who built it. That's enough.